back.
Hello.
I'm Michael,
Hi, I'm Steve.
and you're so formal today.
Yes.
Okay, so our goal in this study is to get into what we did for our fifth class. Was it fifth class?
6.
Maybe six. This is just a never-ending class in how to read the Bible. But we only have 2 more weeks in front of us.
2 more.
And in this next 3 videos, we're going to be looking at Psalms, Proverbs, the Law, and apocalyptic writing. And we're going to start off with Psalms and how to read Psalms. So download everything you can remember about exegesis and contextualization, or go back and watch those videos, because it's all going to apply to how to read Psalms. And we're going to do it in 10 minutes. Right, Steve?
Yes, sir.
So Steve's going to set the clock. And so most often when we think of poems or poetic language in the Bible, usually we just jump right to the book of Psalms, because that is a book of songs or poems. But poems are really found throughout all of the Bible, right? And so, do you read poetry, Steve?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah. Not a lot of people actually read poetry nowadays. Like last night when I asked, a lot of people didn't raise their hand. They don't read it. I don't typically sit down to read it for pleasure.
Where the Sidewalk Ends.
Where the Sidewalk Ends. It's the
best poetry book.
I think I can remember parts of that, Where the Sidewalk Ends. But we may not read a lot of poetry, but people like music, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you like music?
Yeah, I have to.
Why do you have to?
Because I'm a musician.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess if you like music, you can kind of see poetic language used in music, right?
Big time.
Like rap music.
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan? Yeah, maybe Bob Dylan. What's your favorite type of music?
Music?
Yes.
Oh.
You just like it all?
What's your favorite type of cheese? I like them all.
I like sharp cheddar cheese. I like sharp cheddar. My favorite type of music is, I think I like, I don't know. I think I like 80s rock, like
I
stuff
think
like
it's
that.
based on the feeling you're in.
Yeah. I listen to all kinds of music, depending on how I'm feeling. But most of the time I listen to music because I want to play something on the guitar. And so, anyway, rabbit trail. Music's a lot like poetry. That's what I'm trying to get at. When you're listening to music, it has a lot of the same elements as poetry. And so, in fact, the book of Psalms itself was like a hymnal in the modern church. It has a lot of songs that would have been sang for different types of worship.
A lot of these are songs, or are they all songs and some they're in poetry form, or are they poems but people use them in songs?
Well, poems that people use them in songs, but a lot of the music or the poetry part of the book of Psalms can get easily lost in translation, but you would sing a lot of this stuff.
Oh, okay.
And poems are not just in the book of Psalms. In fact, you'll be reading Genesis, and then there'll be a song. Exodus, they'll cross the Red Sea, and then they'll go into a song, almost like the Bible is a musical, where narrative, and then break out into singing. And that's what they do. But I heard about Psalms that these are God's words to us and our words to God, which is a really cool way of thinking about the Psalms, because so many of the Psalms that we listen to or read, they are people expressing how they're feeling to God. Like David, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or when will you shine your face on me? Things like that. David is praying to God about how he's feeling in the moment. And so that's kind of what one of the interesting parts about Psalms is that they are God's words to us and our words to God. There are Psalms of lament, Psalms of thanksgiving, Psalms of trust, Psalms of praise. And so it helps stimulate our prayers. Have you ever tried to pray a psalm?
Yeah.
That's one of a helpful practice if you want to think of how to go through the book of Psalms. It's just like as you're reading it, you're just praying the way that they're feeling. And it's a practice that the church has been doing for a long time. And because the words in poetry dig really deep into our heart, kind of stimulating feelings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so...
I think poetry helps you feel the words a little more.
Yeah, if you read it. Some people in last night's class were just saying that they get struggle and they get frustrated when it comes to poetry because it's just not clear. So anyway, Poetry has some imagery that helps us, that we have to understand about how to read it. First of all, some of the characteristics of poetry is it uses hyperbolic speech or hyperbole. Do you remember what hyperbole was?
Yeah, like an exaggeration.
Yeah, like an over-exaggeration, right?
Over-exaggeration.
I'm so hungry.
Over the top.
Yes, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. I can't actually eat a horse.
No.
Right?
No one should be eating horses.
No. I'm going to die if I just don't get through this video. I'm not. That's hyperbole. Of course, I'm not actually going to die. So poetry uses hyperbole. It also uses personification. Do you remember what personification is?
Yeah, it's the thing that you said about the trees clapping. Like
Yes.
trees that don't clap.
Yes, it's when an inanimate object is said to do something that people can do. Like the trees of the field clap their hands. Or...
the wind spoke to me.
Yeah, I could hear their, like that kind of stuff. The wind is, or the sun shining its face on me.
It's almost like imagery, right?
Yes,
like,
it's imagery. It's that's what you're using, is this language that over exaggerates for effect or puts human emotions on inanimate objects. The trees don't actually clap their hands, but when you imagine the trees clapping their hands, you see how like all creation is worshiping God. It uses metaphors. Like one poem might say, you have a heart of stone, right? But you don't actually have a heart of stone. You do have a cold heart.
Who?
But if I was to say you have a cold heart, what I'm really saying is like what? But that
I have no feelings.
that you don't really have any feelings. Yeah, I don't think you have a cold heart, Steve. So,
it's very warm.
But obviously, like if your heart was cold, like Dave pointed out, you'd be dead. But that's poetic language. It has hyperbole, personifications, metaphors, and similes. And similes are like metaphors, but it uses the terms like or as, like you're as blind as a bat.
So that's the only difference between those two.
Yeah, similes use the words like or as. And there's other forms of that kind of
metaphorical speaking
of imagery. But poems have that hyperbole, personification, metaphors, similes, and they do that so that you can, more than just saying straightforward what's going on, they kind of demonstrate how you feel about something. And so that might be what you got going on. And so also poetry will have parallelisms. And so we have two verses with parallelisms. The first one comes out of Psalm 121, verse 6. And this is just an example of what a parallelism, and this parallelism is a synonymous parallelism, right? They are saying similar things. You want to read it?
Yeah. So, but there is other types of
parallelism? Yes,
parallelism?
there's also antithetical parallelisms. Okay. And I'll read that, or you'll read that one next.
Okay. So this one is
Psalm 20.
The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night.
Yes, the sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon harm you by night. And you see the sun and the moon, day and night, they're parallel to each other. But all those things are coming together to say one main truth. What is the main truth?
That God will not let anything bad happen.
Yeah, nothing's going to harm you. The sun or the moon, day or night, God has got your back.
All day long.
Yes, and all night long.
And all night.
Yes, God has got your back. And so the parallelism is saying that in a poetic way. And somebody who may not like poetry would just say, well, why doesn't it just say that God has got your back, or God is going to watch out for you?
Because it wouldn't have lasted 2,000 years.
Yeah, and it's just such an easy, think about that. You can remember that so well. The sun, as you're walking down the street and you see the sun, nothing's going to harm you in the day. As you look at the moon, nothing's going to harm you at night. And so poems help us to remember things. They help us to visualize things, and that's cool. So that's parallelism. An antithetical parallelism is in Psalm 1. And you have that verse too, right? Yeah, and this, when I say antithetical parallelism, there's a contrast between what it's saying. And Psalm 1 is, blessed is the one who does not. And it tells you the opposite of what you're supposed to do to be a blessed person. What does it say, Steve?
Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers.
Yeah, that's antithetical parallelism. They are parallel to each other, but it's showing by opposite. The blessed person does not walk, stand, or sit. Okay. But instead, he does this. And so it's showing you the very opposite of the thing that it's trying to call you to do, right? And so in that text, what you get is the blessed life and the wicked life, or the unrighteous life. And you see...
So it's like a contrast.
Yeah, you're contrasting the two. It's a parallelism, but it's looking at the opposites. So that's what poems do. Most often, poems are found in the book of Psalms. Also, Proverbs. In the prophets are full of poems. And Micah has a poem, which probably don't have time to read because we only have a few minutes. And I want to talk a little bit about Exodus. But you have these parallelisms, and they're showing you one truth through looking at different angles at it. So one thing we have to understand is when it comes to interpreting poems, they do use exaggerated language, and that's important because you should put up a caution sign before you make any kind of like doctrinal statement based off of a poem. Because although we can find doctrine and theology out of poems or psalms, they're just not always clear because they are hyperbolic. They use metaphors and similes. But notice I'm not saying that you can't find doctrine out of poems. Yeah. In fact, the New Testament full of doctrine out of poems, like what Peter says on Pentecost. He goes back to Psalms. And he also goes back when Jesus is teaching. He goes to Psalms. The book of Hebrews is based off of a psalm. And so I'm not saying you can't find doctrine out of poetry. What I'm saying is you have to be cautious about basing your doctrine in poetry because it does use hyperbole, personification. And we're going to look at an example out of Exodus 15. And we all know the story of the Exodus. The people are enslaved in Egypt. God hears their prayers, rescues them through these magnificent ways and plagues, and Pharaoh eventually lets the people go free. They wander around the desert, and then they come to the Red Sea, and they cross the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army's pursuing them, and then they get washed away in the sea, right? Yeah. And so you can read the narrative up to chapter 14 in Exodus, but in chapter 15, they just break into a song, right? It's called the Song of Moses and Miriam. They just break out singing. And it's a poem. And the reason I want to quote this is because... We should have put more time. The reason I want to quote this is because you see a poem next to the narrative, and you can see how it's exaggerating for effect. For instance, and I'll just look at one verse, asking the question, how did God part the sea? And in the poem, in Exodus 15, verse 8, it says, by the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. So right there you see a personification, the heart of the sea. Do seas have heart? No, they don't actually have a beating heart, right? The heart of the sea is a personification. But how did God part the sea? Did he blow on it with his nostrils? No. But that's what the psalm says.
It's a poem, though.
It's poem, right? If you want to see how God actually parted the sea, go to chapter 14. Verse 21, it says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at night the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it to dry land. So it was an east wind. I guess what I'm saying is, you see, Exodus 15 is probably the best place to study poetry because it has the narrative, how it actually happened, right next to the poem, a way that gives an image to how it happens. And you see that the poetry is using all these things, hyperbole, personification, metaphors, similes. God didn't actually blow his nose on the sea.
You have to use your imagination a little bit.
Yeah, and you have to recognize the truth behind the statements because maybe the statements aren't true. Mm-hmm. There's something very true about God blowing his nose, like his nostrils, and there's something very true, especially with the Hebrew idea that God has a hot nose when he's angry.
Well, that's the very first thing that pops in my mind if God would be a gust of wind.
Yeah. But God isn't actually blowing his nose on the sea. That's not what happened. An east wind came. But this is poetry. So try to find the truth behind a statement that's not meant to be literal. It's still true.
Still true.
It's still saying how God rescued and delivered them, but it's using exaggerated language to get the effect. That's poetry. And because of that, we should be cautious about getting doctrine from poetry, not because we can't, but we should just be very cautious, using the more clear passages, maybe outside of poetry, to help us understand the clear passages. That's all I got. And we did it in 10 minutes. And then a few more.
13.
But 10 minutes. So, all right, that's poetry.
See you next
See you next time. Bye.